Questions to the Prime Minister. Sir Richard Ottaway.
Number one, Mr. Speaker.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others, and in addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Sir Richard Ottaway.
Mr. Speaker, London is a 24/7 global city and the commercial centre of the Western world. With the economy growing and unemployment falling, will he agree that the efforts of the RMT union to bring London to a halt through the tube strike is nothing short of economic vandalism?
Well, I absolutely agree with my right honourable friend. There's absolutely no justification for a strike. We need a modernised tube line working for the millions of Londoners who use it every day. The fact is only 3% of transactions now involve ticket offices, so it makes sense to have fewer people in those offices but more people on the platforms and the stations. So I unreservedly condemn this strike. When the Shadow Defence Minister was asked to do so today, he actually said it was a matter for the union. So I hope that the right honourable gentleman, the Leader of the Opposition, will get up and unreservedly condemn this strike today.
Mr. Speaker, the ongoing floods and storms are seeing families being driven out of their homes and affecting significant parts of the country. As the Prime Minister knows, many of those affected feel the government's response has been slow and that more could have been done sooner. Will the Prime Minister tell the House what action is now being taken to ensure areas affected have all the necessary support they need?
Well, let me update the House on this very serious situation. I don't accept the government has been slow. We've been having COBRA meeting on a daily basis. We've taken action right across the board. But let me give the latest figures. There are currently 328 properties flooded. 122,000 properties were protected last night because of the flood prevention measures in place. That's 1.2 million protected since December. There are still 7 severe flood warnings across the coast of Cornwall, Devon and Dorset in place, and there are 69 flood warnings in place, which means more flooding is expected and that immediate action is required. The Environment Agency also has 219 flood alerts in place. There's been a serious situation in Dorset with so many people losing their electricity. Over 60,000 homes have been reconnected overnight, but as this morning, still there are 8,000 homes without power. Whatever is required, whether it is dredging work on the rivers Tone and Parrett, whether it is support for our emergency services, whether it is fresh money for flood defences, whether it's action across the board, this government will help those families and get this issue sorted.
Mr. Speaker, notwithstanding the Prime Minister's response, he will know that many people in those areas affected do feel that the response has been too slow and do feel that they have been left on their own and isolated. Now, does he agree with me that the events we have seen demand a comprehensive look at the government's investment in flood protection and the speed of its response? Now, the Prime Minister promised that the government would report to the House on these issues by the end of January. Can he tell us when that report will be available?
Minister.
Well, the Secretary of State for the Environment has given repeated statements in this House, but I can tell the House he will make a comprehensive statement tomorrow. Let me answer very directly the issue about flooding. This government has spent £2.4 billion over this four-year period, which is more than the £2.2 billion spent under the previous government. But let me announce today that a further £100 million will be made available to fund essential flood repairs and maintenance over the next year. This will cover £75 million for repairs, £10 million for urgent work in Somerset to deliver the action plan that's being prepared by the local agencies, and £15 million for extra maintenance. Now, I would make the point, Mr. Speaker, we are only able to make these decisions because we've looked after the nation's finances carefully. But I can confirm that is new money that will protect more houses and help our country more with floods, and we'll continue to do what is right.
Mr. Speaker, I've got to say to the Prime Minister, actually the figures show that the investment by the government has fallen over this period, and not risen. But the reality is that the scale of challenge we face from climate change and floods demands that we have that comprehensive look at the investment that is required. And I'm glad that the Prime Minister has said that the Environment Secretary will come to the House tomorrow. I want to turn to another subject, Mr. Speaker. Now, the Prime Minister said that in 2014 he was going to lead the way on women's equality. Can the Prime Minister tell us how's that going in the Conservative Party?
First of all, let me just go back to the very important issue of flooding. I want to...
Order! Order! People getting very excited on both sides of the House. The question has been put. The answer must be heard. The Prime Minister.
I'm glad with Falkirk going on he's asking me about constituency selection, but let me briefly return to the issue of floods, because I want to just clarify this point about the funding. If you look at the period 2010 to 2014, when this government was in office, the funding was £2.4 billion, more than when Labour were in office. Secondly, because this will be of interest to a number of constituency MPs, obviously when it comes to funding, the Belwyn scheme also matters because it's the way the government supports local authorities. So let me tell the House that we will... I do think...
Order! Order! Mr. Ruane, you are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man! Prime Minister.
I know that many honourable members with flooded homes in their constituencies will want to hear about the Belwyn scheme because it's the way that central government helps local government. And so let me say, we will be paying local authorities 100% of eligible costs above the Belwyn grant threshold. We'll be extending the eligible... Mr. Speaker,
Order! However long this session takes, the questions will be heard and the answers will be heard. That is what order. That is what the public has a right to expect of this House. The Prime Minister.
They claim to be concerned, but then won't listen to the answers. We are extending the eligible spending period for Belwyn claims until the end of March 2014, recognising that the bad weather is continuing. And I can say to colleagues in Cornwall that we will make sure they don't suffer from having a unitary authority, which I know they believe is very important. Now, on the important issue of getting more women into public life, yes, this is fantastically important for our country because we will not represent or govern our country properly unless we have more women at every level in our public life and in our politics. Now, I am proud of the fact that as leader of the Conservative Party, the number of women MPs has gone from 17 to 48, but we need to do much more. I want this to go further. We've also seen more women in work than ever before, a tax cut for 11 million women. We've stopped pensions being discriminated against women, and we're putting women at the front of our international aid programmes. Those are the actions that we are taking. There is more to do, but we have a good record of helping women in our economy.
Mr. Speaker, I do have to say, a picture tells 1,000 words. This is a Prime Minister who said...
Order, I apologise for having to interrupt again. Members, calm yourselves. It is only just after midday. Many hours of the day remain. Don't destroy your systems by exploding. Mr. Ed Miliband.
Picture tells 1,000 words. Look at the all-male front bench raised before us. And he says he wants to represent the whole country. Mr. Speaker, I guess they didn't let women into the Bullingdon Club either. So there we go. Now, he said a third of his ministers would be women. He's nowhere near meeting the target. Half of the women he appointed as ministers after the election have resigned or been sacked. And in his cabinet, get this, Mr. Speaker, in his cabinet, there are as many men who went to Eton or Westminster as there are women. That is the picture. Does he think it's his fault that the Conservative Party has a problem with women?
He's interested in the figures. Let me give him the figures. Of the full members of the cabinet who are Conservatives, 24%, a quarter of them are women. Not enough. I want to see that grow. Of the front bench ministers of the Conservatives, around 20% are women. That is below what I want to achieve in 33%. We are making progress and we'll make more progress. But let me make this point. This party is proud of the fact that we had a woman Prime Minister. Yes. Yes. No. To be fair. To be fair to the Labour Party, to be...
Order! Mr. Gove. Order! Order! You really are a very overexcitable individual. You need to write out 1,000 times, "I will behave myself" at Prime Minister's questions. The Prime Minister.
To be fair to the Labour Party, they have had some interim leaders who are women, but they have this habit of replacing them with totally ineffective men.
Of course, Mr. Speaker, he mentions Lady Thatcher. Unlike him, she was a Tory leader who won general elections. And Mr. Speaker, I noticed the member for Harwich and North Essex in his place, and he wrote a very interesting article recently. He said, "We men are all guilty of such unconscious slights to women." The Prime Minister recently greeted a leading high-profile businesswoman at a reception by asking, "Where's your husband?" Now, Mr. Speaker, that says it all, and the reason representation matters is because it shapes the policies a government introduces and how they impact on women in the country. And he is failing women. Can he say why, for the first time in 5 years, has the gap between men's and women's pay increased?
Prime Minister!
The fact is there are more women in work in our country than ever before in our history. We've seen a tax cut for 12 million women, a pension increase that is benefiting women, tax-free childcare that will help women who want to go out to work, more support on childcare. Now, he talks about MPs and candidates. He might enjoy this one. The candidate for Wythenshawe, the Labour candidate for Wythenshawe, has made an endorsement today. He has endorsed Miliband. David Miliband.
Mr. Speaker, if I were him, I would not be talking about candidates this week of all weeks. Because what is the Tory party doing? Removing one of their most senior women and seeking to replace her with an old Etonian. It says it all about the Conservative Party. And he didn't answer the question. I'll tell him why the gender pay gap is increasing, because the minimum wage has been losing value, because the growth of zero-hours contracts, and the problem women have accessing childcare. He promised to modernise his party, but he's going backwards. He runs his government like the old boys' network. That's why he's failing women across his party and across the country.
Isn't it interesting that with 6 questions and an invitation to condemn the strike today, not a word? Isn't that the truth? He raises constituency selections in a week when he's completely rolled over to the trade unions. Let's be clear about what is happening. They keep their block vote, they get more power over their discretionary funding, and they get 90% of the votes for their leader. He told us he was going to get rid of the red flag. All he's done is run up the white flag.
Mr. Speaker, we're 40 farms in West Norfolk, led by Bestpac and Gilchrist Confectionery, expanding. This has led to unemployment falling by 20% since March last year. Is he aware that this means another 440 hard-working families receiving a pay packet, facing a brighter future under our long-term economic plan?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right. We saw 2 weeks ago the biggest increase in employment in one quarterly figures since the records began in the 1970s. We're seeing unemployment come down, more people in work, Most of those new jobs, the overwhelming majority, are full-time jobs. 9 out of 10 of those jobs over the last year have been actually in better paid professions rather than low paid jobs. So we are seeing economic success. And every one of those jobs isn't just a statistic, it's someone with a pay packet who can help take care of their family and have the dignity and security that work brings. But isn't it surprising? Not a word about the economy today from Labour. They know because it's growing and all their forecasts were wrong.
Mr. Speaker, in evidence to the Welsh Select Committee, the leader of the Welsh Conservative Assembly Group said about the lockstep on income tax in the draft Wales Bill it was not a sensible course of action. Subsequently that day, the Secretary of State for Wales said that he was expressing very much a personal view of his own. Later, he received a letter from the Welsh Assembly Group, the Conservatives, saying it was very much their opinion. Who speaks for Wales? Is it the Secretary of State for Wales or the Leader of the Assembly?
Well, the Secretary of State is doing a superb job standing up for Wales, and only yesterday he and I were discussing how we're going to make sure the NATO conference coming to Wales is going to be a success for the whole of the Welsh economy. In terms of the future of devolution, we are in favour of taking these further steps. We'll be bringing forward legislation, we'll be taking steps and making sure that people in Wales have a real say. And I want the Conservatives in Wales to stand up as the low-tax party in Wales. And under our devolution plan, that's exactly what they'll do.
Eton Harris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A couple of weeks ago, the Daventry University Technical College opened the doors to its new campus where, under the stewardship of its excellent principal, David Edmondson, its first 96 students will be learning the vocational skills that young people need to compete in the future. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that university technical colleges, like Daventry's, will ensure that young people across our country have a brighter and more secure future and are able to reap the benefits of our long-term economic plan?
Friend is absolutely right. Making sure we have the best skills and the best schools is an absolutely key part of our long-term economic plan, and I support very much the University Technical College movement. The number of pupils taught in underperforming schools under this government has fallen by 250,000 in 4 years. Again, that isn't just a statistic, that is tens of thousands of young people who are going to have the chance of a good education, a good future, and the chance to get a job and get involved in our modern economy. And UTCs are well placed to help thousands of students in that way.
Taggart.
On the 22nd of February 2012, I asked the Prime Minister about fraud at A4E, a company working with job seekers. He told me he was waiting for the truth before he would act. This week's guilty pleas by A4E staff reveal a culture of fraud in that company. Isn't the list of taxpayer-funded fraudsters, Serco, G4S, A4E, getting too long? When's it going to stop?
Well, I think the Honourable Lady makes an important point, but the answer I would give is, instead of bandying around names of companies where many people in those companies will be working hard to do a good job, what we should do is investigate wrongdoing properly and make sure that cases are properly taken to court, as in this case it clearly was.
Mr. Graham Stewart.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Prime Minister share my outrage at the false choice presented by the Chairman of the Environment Agency between protecting urban and rural areas from flood? And does he recognise that my constituents in Holderness and others in Somerset Levels and elsewhere expect decent maintenance, dredging and not abandonment?
Quite right.
I think my honourable friend is absolutely right. There shouldn't be a false choice between protecting the town or protecting people who live in the countryside. I think what we need to see, and where I think the debate is now rightly going, is that from the late 1990s, far too long, the Environment Agency believed that it was wrong to dredge. Now, those of us with rural constituencies that have been affected by flooding have seen the effectiveness of some dredging that's taken place. Now, if it's good for some places, I think we need to make the argument that it will be good for many more places. Now, I've said we're going to see dredging on the Tone and the Parrot in the Somerset Levels, because that will make a difference. But I believe it's time for Natural England, the Environment Agency and the departments to sit round the table and work out a new approach that will make sure that something that did work, frankly, for decades and centuries is reintroduced again.
Mr. Speaker, Queen Victoria was on the throne when the Dunlop factory in Erdington first produced tyres, of world-class tyres for the motorsport industry. Jaguar Land Rover now need the land which it owns for the welcome expansion of the Jaguar plant. The Business Secretary and Birmingham City Council have identified 3 sites and a financial package to relocate. Will the Prime Minister join with the Business Secretary and I in urging Goodyear Dunlop to look at those alternatives and not walk away from 125 years of manufacturing history?
I was being briefed on this issue just before coming to the Chamber. I'm very happy to look carefully at it and see what can be done. The recovery of the automotive sector, particularly in the West Midlands, as the Honourable Gentleman said, has been hugely welcome for our country. Dunlop is a historic name and a historic brand, and I'll certainly do everything I can to work with the Business Secretary and him to get a good outcome.
Mr. Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. South Essex is proof that our long-term economic plan is working. However, the current options under consideration for an additional Lower Thames crossing are limited in their ambition and do not maximise the economic potential of the Thames Gateway. Will my right honourable friend therefore agree to meet with me and other interested colleagues so that he can hear why option A and certainly option C are not the right answer?
Well, where Essex goes, so often the rest of the country follows. Obviously, as my honourable friend says, this is an important issue. We've got to look at all the potential bottlenecks that can hold back our economy. I'm very happy to meet with him and colleagues. The Thames Gateway is an absolutely vital development for our country, and I want to see economic development spread throughout our country, so happy to hold that meeting.
Doyle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Royal Mail shares are currently trading at 587p, almost 80% higher than when the government sold off its share. Does the Prime Minister still honestly believe that his government properly valued Royal Mail and that the price was set at the best deal to get the best deal for the taxpayer?
I think the government did a good job to get private sector capital into Royal Mail, something which frankly has evaded governments of all colours and all persuasions for decades. And I well remember sitting on that side of the House and hearing about the appalling losses in Royal Mail, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of pounds. And I think the fact that it is now well managed, well run with private sector capital in it is a very great development for our country.
Thank you. In Erewash, we have a proud and strong history of supporting apprenticeships across a range of sectors. With National Apprenticeship Week approaching next month, does my right honourable friend agree with me that the emphasis and drive by this government on increasing apprenticeships, and that's for men and women, is exactly what is needed to support people getting back into work and training?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. This government has invested records amount in apprenticeships. Over 1.5 million people have started apprenticeships, including many in the East Midlands, including some that I met with her in her constituency. Again, these aren't just statistics. Each and every one of these apprentices is someone who's getting a chance, a skill, a job, and the opportunity to build a life for themselves and to build that stability, that peace of mind, that security, which should be the birthright of every single person in our country.
Mr. Ben Bradshaw.
Can I tell the Prime Minister that the loss of the railway line at Dawlish in the overnight storms is a devastating blow to the economies of Devon and Cornwall? It comes just a year after we lost our railway service for a whole month in last year's floods. Does he accept that as a country we are going to have to spend a great deal more investing in the resilience of our transport infrastructure, and that we need a government that is united both in its acceptance of and its determination to do something about climate change?
Well, I agree wholeheartedly with the right honourable gentleman on a number of points. First of all, we need to make sure that urgent action is taken to restore these transport links, and that's why I'll be chairing a COBRA this afternoon, bringing together the problems of the power reductions, the floods, and also the effect on our transport. Second of all, we need to make sure we go on investing in rail schemes, and this government is putting record amounts into rail schemes. The third point, where I totally agree with him, we have done and need to continue to do a real analysis of the resilience of our infrastructure, something that's now carried out by the Cabinet Office, and where extra investment and protections are needed, they must be put in place.
Henry Smith.
Minister recently visited Vent Axia in my constituency, who have brought manufacturing jobs back. to this country from China. Can he say what the government are doing to encourage more reshoring of jobs to the UK as part of our long-term economic plan?
No, it's a huge pleasure to go to Crawley with my honourable friend and see a company that makes ventilation equipment actually bringing jobs from China back into the UK. Now, this is a small trend at the moment. 1,500 jobs in manufacturing have been reshored since 2011. But if we manage to make sure our energy is competitive, if we keep our labour markets flexible and competitive, if we make this a friendly country for business with low tax rates, including low corporate tax rates, there's no reason why we shouldn't see more companies coming back to Britain. But we won't get that if we have an anti-enterprise, anti-business, anti-growth Labour Party.
Rosie Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, the CQC issued an appalling and damning report on Liverpool community health. Will the Prime Minister undertake to have the historic HR practices, the disciplinary actions and the subsequent payoffs which were used as a mechanism to bully staff forensically examined and ensure that the executive team and the board are held to account and actually make this huge statement that bullying is not acceptable in the NHS?
I think the Honourable Lady is absolutely right to raise this specific case, but also the general lessons that it brings. Of course, we still have more to do, but I think the CQC is a hugely improved organisation. We've now got a Chief Inspector of Hospitals. All of this now, I think, is much more transparent than it has been in the past, but very happy to look at the specific concerns she has about bullying and make sure that the CQC deals with this. We've got, I think it is this week actually, the anniversary of that dreadful report into the Stafford Hospital, and my right honourable friend is absolutely committed to making sure there's a change of culture in our NHS where we don't put up with poor practice, and where there are problems we're not afraid or ashamed to surface them, not just talk about them but deal with them.
Mel Stride.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In my constituency, business confidence is growing and unemployment has fallen by over a quarter in the last 12 months. So would my right honourable friend agree with me that we should take no lectures from the Shadow Chancellor, that we should, particularly given the report, the Green Budget IFS report, which said, and I quote from last week, the largest challenge for the Chancellor remains having to contend with the consequences of the Great Recession, a recession caused by the party opposite.
I think my honourable friend is making an important point, and the Institute for Fiscal Studies report out this morning does say that the change in economic outlook from a year ago is really quite remarkable. It says the UK recovery is getting ever closer to achieving escape velocity. We keep being told by the Shadow Chancellor it's about time. If we'd listened to him, there'd be more borrowing, more spending, more taxing, more debt. His view is very clear that if we gave him back the keys to the car, he'd drive it just as fast and into the same wall and wreck the economy all over again.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Prime Minister make clear whether he still, quite wrongly, is going to try to end the ban on fox hunting?
My view remains what was in the manifesto on which I stood, which is the House of Commons should have the opportunity to have a debate and a vote on this issue.
Sir Mingus Campbell.
Does my right honourable friend share the anxiety of many of us that the programme for the destruction of chemical weapons in Syria has fallen so badly behind?
I agree with my right honourable friend. What was a very promising start, with chemicals not only being discovered and removed but also destroyed, there do seem to be now indications that the programme is slowing and that not all the information necessary is forthcoming. I discussed this issue in a telephone call with President Putin some 48 hours ago. Britain will continue to put pressure on all parties to make sure the chemical weapons are produced and destroyed.
Meg Hillier.
Mr. Speaker, overseas students who are offered places at top British universities get extra coaching in English and maths. But hard-working Hackney students from poor backgrounds with top A-level predictions are not even offered a place if they have a C grade in maths. This is not fair and doesn't help social mobility. What's the Prime Minister going to do to support hard-working Hackney students?
Well, first of all, we must continue with what has been happening in Hackney, which is the introduction of new academy schools, like the Mossbourne Academy, which is one of the most impressive schools I've ever visited in any country, anywhere in the world. So we need to continue with that. We need to continue with my right honourable friend, the Chancellor's plan, to uncap student numbers at our universities, so that anyone who can get the grades is able to have a place at those universities. On the specific point she makes about GCSE grades, we have to be clear that in the end it is universities that set the criteria rather than government, but I'm very happy to look at the specific issue. I also believe, as the Education Secretary has said, that if people don't make the correct grades in GCSEs, particularly in English and maths, then we ought to be encouraging retakes and more work. The reason for that is there isn't a job in the world that doesn't require good English and maths, and that's a very important message to go out.
Anne-Marie Morris.
No doubt the Prime Minister saw the scenes of destruction resulting from storm damage in Dawlish in my constituency. Our rail line is out of action. 25 families have been evacuated. One house is about to fall into the sea. Devon and Cornwall feel cut off. Can the Prime Minister confirm he is taking all action possible to get transport systems back in action, families back in their homes, and crucially, that he will look at fast-tracking a review of the funding for a breakwater to protect the railway line and residents, which currently cannot be implemented until 2019 for lack of funding?
No, I'm very happy to look at all of the suggestions that she makes. That is why we're holding this Cobra this afternoon. I think members right across the House know that not only is this a vital artery for the southwest of our country, but it's also one of the most scenic and beautiful railway lines anywhere in our country. So it's hugely upsetting and disturbing what has happened. We will look at all the options and we'll look at them with great urgency.
Pat Glass.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister will be aware of the investigation into the systematic beating, abuse and rape of young men and boys at the Medemsley Detention Centre, the former Medemsley Detention Centre in my constituency. The victim toll has now topped 300, and this is the biggest investigation ever undertaken by Durham Constabulary, a relatively small police force. Will the Prime Minister commit that if it proves necessary, his Home Secretary will meet with the PCC, the Chief Constable and myself to ensure that the highly successful team has the resources it needs to see this investigation to its conclusion? The victims deserve no less.
Minister.
I'm very happy to give the Honourable Lady that assurance, because I don't support the police merger ideas of the past. I think some of our smaller police forces are hugely capable, but when they're doing very complex and large investigations like this, on occasion they do need help and support, and so we should make sure that that is available. I'm very pleased with the work that the National Crime Agency is doing, now fully established, up and running, and able to deal with some of the more serious crimes in terms of people smuggling and sexual abuse and the like. And I think we'll hear more from them about the great work they're doing. But how the assurance you get?
Mr. William whilst congratulating my right honourable friend on the EU referendum bill, and also the whole of the House of Commons in passing it, will my right honourable friend tell us whether the dead parrot is actually merely resting, and does he have a Baldrick-like plan to introduce the Parliament Act so that we can get the parrot squawking again?
Well, I hope that this particular parrot, that has obviously beautiful plumage, can be resuscitated if one of my colleagues is fortunate enough to win the private member's bill. On this side of the House, we know that the British public deserve a stay, and I'm sure that one of my colleagues would be delighted to bring the bill back in front of this House. But let's be clear, shall we, because they've all got a bit quiet over there, as they say. Let's be clear about why this bill was killed in the House of Lords. The Labour Party, and I'm afraid to say the Liberal Democrat Party, do not want to give the British people a say. Now, this House, frankly, should feel affronted. We voted for this bill. We supported this bill. So I hope this House will come together as one and insist on this bill.
In the Chancellor's budget of 2012, he made a very welcome announcement about tax breaks for the computer games industry. This was passed to the European Commission last April, and since then we've heard nothing, and the games body, Tiger, are saying it's having a very detrimental effect on the industry. Can the Prime Minister, and indeed the Chancellor, do something to address this delay?
Minister.
No, I absolutely share the honourable gentleman's frustration. I think it's perfectly within a government's rights to set out a way of helping and supporting vital industries like this that are so important for the future of our country. We're discussing it with the European Commission. We're hopeful of good news to come shortly.
Last but not least, Mr. Andrew George.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following the questions from the Honourable Right Honourable Member for Exeter and from Teenbridge, of course it's absolutely true that the residents in Cornwall, following the most recent storms, have been concerned that actually England would be completely cut off. And in view of that, whilst MPs from Cornwall and the South West have been content to support the billions necessary for HS2 and other transport projects to the north, does the Prime Minister not accept that actually the relatively small amounts needed are now needed to ensure the resilience of the rail line between Penzance and Paddington?
I know from personal experience how vital the Penzance to Paddington link is and how many people rely on it. So I'm happy to look at this very urgently. Let me just repeat something I was trying to say at the beginning of questions about the Belwyn scheme, because I know that Cornish members of Parliament are concerned that now they have a unitary authority, they'd need a very big claim before triggering Belwyn. We're sorting that out, so the money and the assistance will be there. But on the transport links, it is an urgent requirement to get this right.
Order.